In the previous 2 lessons, I gave you the basic overview of how to send emails in Laravel, but we haven't really talked about structure yet. Clearly, you don't want to be calling mail send directly from your routes. That was just for an example. So now, in this lesson, let's go over structure. All right, within my apps directory, I'm going to create a new folder, and we're going to call this Mailers. Now, this is where all of our mailers are going to be stored. So we will have one abstract, sort of a master mailer that will have some of our common methods, and then you will have child mailers for various things, such as maybe newsletters or a mailer specifically for the user so that you can send a welcome email or an account closed email or any kind of updates like that. All right, so we'll begin with this new file, and we'll call it mailer.php. And if I hide the sidebar, I will namespace this as mailers. Maybe you want to put this under your top level app heading. We don't really have that for this project, so we will just call it mailers. And I'll call it class mailer. So the first thing that we need to capture is basic stuff, like who is it to? What is the email? Or what about the subject in the view that's responsible for this? So with that in mind, we'll do a protected to, and then I'll just duplicate this a handful of times. We will want the email, presumably. We'll want a subject, a view, data for the view, and we may add more shortly, but let's see what we can do with this for now. And by the way, we're going to make this abstract because we don't expect the class to be instantiated on its own. It's going to depend on a child class in order to work. All right, next let's take care of the constructor. Now, at least for now, we may change this later and move it to a child class, but I'm going to expect maybe that a user object is injected into it. And that way we can immediately grab some of the necessary information, like who is it to and what is the email address. We can grab that directly off of the user object. So let's see, maybe we will say this too is going to be equal to the user's name. So we'll say user, username, and then this email is going to be user, email. Now we may update this, but for now, let's continue on to a deliver method. This is going to be the method that physically sends the email. So we could say mail, and I'm going to make sure I precede it with a backslash because otherwise it's going to look for the class mailers mail like that. And we want to grab the actual facade. Now, if you're worried about testability and you're thinking, well, do I need to inject an instance of Illuminate's mailer class? No, because this is a facade, you can easily swap it out with a mocked version. So you don't need to worry about doing that in this case. So we'll simply say mail send. And like before, the first argument is going to be what is the view? Next, what is the data that will be sent to the view? By default, that's going to be equal to an empty array. And then thirdly, we're going to have our callback function, and this is where we can build the message. So we will say message to is going to be this email, as well as this too. So we're going to send it to their email address and whatever their name is. And then I will set the subject to this subject. Now, one thing to keep in mind is we're taking advantage of a lot of PHP 5.4 stuff. So we have the JavaScript-like syntax for creating arrays, and also, even though I am within an anonymous function here, or a closure, I can still reference the this instance from within it, and that's something that you couldn't do in older versions of PHP. If you still want this to work, you could say maybe self equals this, and then you could pass it through like so, and then you could say self email. But let's stick with 5.4. This is going to be only for my or your project, so we have the luxury of using the latest features. So now when somebody instantiates a child class, the constructor is automatically going to run, and then we're going to provide a deliver method on that class that will send the mail using the various properties that have been set. Now, one thing I'm thinking here is that I'm assuming that a user object will be passed. So maybe I will begin this by saying if it is not an object, then I'm going to throw an exception. And we'll say throw new invalid contact information exception. And let's just go ahead and add that up here. You can export this out if you want, or you can keep it within the class. Don't worry about it too much. Class invalid contact info exception extends exception. And then the message will be please pass a valid user object. Like I said, this may be better being placed within a child class. We just need to decide. But for now, we're going to store it within the abstract parent class. All right, so now when the class is instantiated, if an object is not passed, then we're going to throw an exception. Otherwise, we're going to set the to and the email properties. Now, for subject and views, those will always be unique to whatever mail you're sending. So if you are sending a welcome email, well, obviously the view for that is going to be different from the account cancellation email. And that's why we're going to store that within a child class. All right, so let's leave this like it is for now. Next, I'm going to create a new class, and we will call it usermailer.php. Once again, namespace this within mailers, and class userMailer extends mailer. So we're going to pull in the abstract mailer so we have access to some of these methods and properties. So for our first method, let's say this is the welcome email. Well, we're going to set the subject. So we'll say subject equals welcome to my site. You would obviously tailor that to your company or business. And then next, we want to set the view. And if I open this up, it will be within emails. Perhaps we will call this user, and within here, we'll say welcome.blade.php. And for now, I will simply say welcome to the site. We can add some HTML later. All right, emails, user, welcome. Finally, I'm going to return this so that I can allow for chaining. And now if I switch over to my routes file, if I try to create a new instance of this, let's just do this, new instance of mailers, user mailer, and we try to run this, PHP artisan serve, we're going to get a fatal error exception, and it's letting us know, hey, I couldn't find that class. And that's because we need to make sure that we auto-load it. Now, there are two different ways we could do this. One, I could switch over to my composer.json file and run app.mailers. That would be perfectly fine. However, if you do add additional mailers, so if I add a new newsletter mailer, I need to run composer dump autoload every single time. Another possibility would be to leverage Laravel's native autoloader. So I can go to start, global, and then I could copy this and add mailers. The advantage to this would be that you don't have to rerun composer dump autoload every single time. However, I'm not going to worry about it in this case. Let's just stick with adding it to composer. So I will run composer dump autoload. And once again, if I reboot the server, we can see it is reading the file, but it looks like I made an error on line 3. So let's go ahead and fix that quickly. And I'm sure you saw that. Let's make sure we fix both of these and make sure we refer to the global exception class. So now we are getting an exception, but we know everything is working. It's just letting us know, hey, you need to pass in an argument to the constructor. So let's go ahead and do that now. We need to fetch a user from our users table, but I don't have anything in this case. If I switch over, you can see I have an empty table here. However, I do have my generators tool set up, so that means I can create the migration pretty darn quickly. So I'll create a new migration called create users table that will have a username and maybe an email address. We're going to keep this very simple, not even a password. But now that we'll go ahead and create that, and then finally migrate the database. All right, that should do it. Now, if I reload, you'll see we do have this users table. And let's just go ahead and hard code some of these in, jeffrey@envato.com. All right, so now we have a new users table with a single record. Let's just go ahead and fetch that record. So we'll say user equals user first. And now we're going to create a new instance of the user mailer and pass in our user object or instance. So let's view the chain of operations here. We instantiate user mailer. We don't have a constructor here, so it's going to default to the abstract mailers constructor that will accept the user object, and then it will set the to and email properties, and that's all it's going to do. So if I return, and at this point we say mailer, and I var dump mailer, if I view this in the browser, you'll see, yep, we do have that object with those two properties set. So now all we want to do is call the welcome method and then finally deliver the email. However, before I can do this, I need to remember to look over my email settings. So I will switch to mail as we did in the previous lessons. And this time we will use gmail.com. We'll stick with the default port of 587. I'm going to use some base from credentials. This would be your company and a special email address for that. And then I, of course, can't show you my username and password to Gmail, but if you're working along, just use your own. Good, that's finished. Now I can run mailer, welcome, deliver. So before we determine if this works, let's look over it. Well, we call the welcome method. That simply sets a couple properties as well as the view that we will be using, and then it returns this so that we can continue chaining. Then we call deliver, which will run mail send. It's going to grab the view that we specified right here, so it's going to load the contents of that view. If there is any data that should be bound to the view, you can store it within this data. So if you have special things like this data, you could do that, and we'll come back to that shortly. And then finally, this callback function right here is going to help build the message, and that's it. So we can return that, which should return a Boolean, I believe, based on whether it was sent correctly or not. All right, let's try this out in the browser. But before I do, let's just provide some level of feedback like sent. All right, I'm going to reload the page. You'll see it sending. Once again, this is a little slow. These are the types of things that you want to do in background jobs, but we're not quite there yet. But now we can see sent. So if I verify it, sure enough, there it is in my inbox. All right, so now let's talk about binding data to the view. Like I noted, by default, it's just passing this data, which is an empty array. If you want to override that, well, let's see what we might do. Within the views file, let's open up welcome, and we'll say, hi there, and then the username, welcome to the site. Nothing special, we're still just sticking with plain text. But anyhow, if I try it out now, we're going to get another exception. Hey, I didn't know what username is. And of course it didn't. We didn't pass any username variable to the view. We only passed an empty array. So to override that, you could say this data, this is one way we could do it, would be username, and then run this too. Remember, this too is going to be equal to the username on that returned user object. But that should be enough to make it work. So if I reload the page, give it just a second to process, now it has been sent. And here we can see the second email where it is passing in the username as we would hope. However, this is something that I would imagine is fairly common. You're going to send an email, and generally you'll just want to have access to some of the information from the user row in the table. So why don't we make that the default? I'm going to return to the mailer, and we will say this data equals user. Then I can get rid of this empty array. So now by default, we're going to set the data that is bound to the view equal to the user instance, and let's convert that to an array. However, you can always override that. If you have special settings, then you can just override it like we've done here. But this way, you can leave it off, and we have a sensible default that will still work. So if I come back, reload the page, give it just a moment again, now you can see I have a third email, and yep, we're getting the exact same thing. So now we have these nice containers that we can use. For example, let's come back to the routes file, and now maybe we want to do something else. Maybe you want to send them an account cancellation email. Well, you would simply create a new instance of the user mailer, or if it's something different, like I noted, maybe for a newsletter, well, you would have a newsletter mailer class as well. But we're going to stick with the mailer for anything related to the logged in user. So now I would say something like mailer, account cancellation, deliver. So we're going to call a method called account cancellation. Maybe you can make that better. And then we're going to deliver that. So then all you would need to do is return to your user mailer. We're going to create another one for account cancellation and simply update some of the settings. We're sorry to see you go. And then maybe set the view would be emails.user.cancel. Now let's add the cancellation view, cancel.blade.php. And maybe I will add just a bit of HTML here. And we'll say goodbye, username. We hope you'll consider us again in the future. And then finally, within strong tags, management. All right, so now we have this view. We have an account cancellation method. I'm going to make sure I return this so that it makes it really easy to chain these methods. And now I think it should work. So let's try it out again. If I reload the page, I get undefined constant username. That is probably, just forgot to add the $sign. All right, one more time. Give that a second to run. That's finished. So now if I check my email again, and as we hoped, it works. So we have the subject, we are using the HTML here, and we did successfully pass the user instance to the view. Great, so now there's only one more thing I want to do. What about the situations where you want to update the message builder? So for example, if I open up the mailer again, and I scroll down, this is just the base common mailer where it sets the to, it sets the subject. But what if maybe you want to CC something to a member of the management team? Or what if you want to attach your logo or something like that, but only for special methods? Well, that'll be the final thing we tackle here. Here's what I think I will do. Maybe these methods can accept an options function. So I could say options equals a function, and that should receive the SwiftMailer message object. So then I can tack on like message attach, public path, maybe go into the img directory and get the logo. If I switch over to the sidebar, you will see that I already have added a logo to the ing directory. So now I simply want to attach that image to the message. So how can we make this work? Well, we just need to update the mailer class. I will begin by adding a new option here, protected options. And now I will say, maybe right here, if is callable this options, then let's run it. Call user func this options, and let's pass through the SwiftMailer message. So now, as long as it's callable, and it won't be in most cases, but in the case of the welcome method, we have made that equal to a closure here. So it will be callable. In that case, we're simply going to run that closure and pass the SwiftMailer message to it so that we can continue doing anything else we want to do. Maybe you want to CC somebody. You have access to all of those methods on the SwiftMailer class. All right, so let's go ahead and try this out. We're going to switch back so that we run the welcome method instead of cancellation. So welcome, here's our logo. And now, if I reload the page, we cross our fingers, and now you'll see we've received the email, but this time we have attached the image. So have a play around with this. Now the mailer is mostly done for this very simple example. So if you do need to create additional methods, it's only a matter of updating your user mailer, specifying your new method. Maybe you should try out one on your own for a newsletter mailer. That would require its own class. And then maybe you could add methods for weekly to send a weekly newsletter or a monthly newsletter. And then you can just run a cron job to execute these. Finally, once the method is added, wherever it is, maybe in your controller, maybe you have a contact controller, you would simply create a new instance, pass in your user object, call the necessary method, dependent upon the email that you want to send, and deliver it. Have fun, and let me know if you have any questions.